Good day, everybody. My name's Sam Kemble with Workforce Delivery Inc. Happy April 25th, 2018. Welcome to the second part of our Respect in the Workplace series. And today we'll be speaking about respect in the workplace in a post-MeToo environment from an employer's perspective. Now, just to offer clarification and hopefully to avoid any maybe miscommunication potential, I just want to say that in order to do this segment, we absolutely do need to offer a definition of what the Me Too movement is and what the Time's Up movement is. And for that, we've gathered some sources to cite from online that describe both the movements, I think, in a fairly objective way. But we're not the ones to speak on behalf of the movements. We're the first to admit to that. Both myself and my firm are allies, but we would be allies from a side, which is where most of the allies from the movement should be. So I just want to make sure that it's clear that our intention is not to weigh into in any way speaking on behalf of the movement itself. We will be looking at some organizations' response to it, some good, some bad, and that's the area that we want to focus our discussion on, which is a human resource response to the Me Too movement from organizations in Canada. Now, to qualify ourselves to speak about that, I just want to offer that in the last few years, our firm is actually only from 2012 to 2015, we hired about 27,000 people, hired and mobilized 27,000 Canadians to construction sites across Western Canada, including we heavily focused on hiring from Ontario when the auto sector was hurting, and projects in the West was able to help. And you can see a little bit of that evidence from the dots. Each red dot depicts a primary residence of a person that we mobilized to a construction site that was able to benefit from the resource sector in Western Canada. So we were involved with that. We have a fairly wide sampling of individuals that we've worked with and recruited. And unlike other recruiters, we've typically met people at the gate. So it's not like we've recruited and said, see you later. We've actually met people on the project, and then we've managed those individuals during their tenure on the project. And that includes in respect to performance management needs, travel needs, and camp needs. And so we've encountered, in addition to all this, hundreds, actually thousands of investigations that we've performed in regards to all kinds of performance management, whether it be safety rule violations, alcohol and drug work rule violations, respect in the workplace violations. And respect in the workplace violations would include sexual harassment, racial harassment, discrimination, bullying, violence, both on and off the work site. We've really done it all. So we have some real street smart or in the trenches experience in regards to doing human resources and respect in the workplace investigations on a massive scale. In addition to that, we were also myself, actually, I was a co-chair of the Respect in the Workplace policy for the Construction Owners Association of Alberta, together with Laurie Miller, where we actually drafted the founding documents, the founding policy of the Respect in the Workplace together. And that's where we developed an integrative policy that included bullying, harassment, and violence rolled into one. And that was adopted and mobilized on construction sites, and also by a number of other employers, including governmental employers across Canada, because we developed it to be open sourced. So that kind of qualifies, or at least locates me in terms of the vantage point from which I will be speaking to you today. I hope you enjoy this segment, and I look forward to your comments. Take care. Okay. It's time to get into the respect in the workplace policy frameworks and how they're impacted by the Me Too movement and the Time's Up movement. What are the real impacts, real and perceived impacts, and how do organizations need to respond? So what is Me Too? Me Too is a movement that uses a hashtag that was created 10 years ago by Tarana Burke. And it was, the hashtag went viral after Alyssa Milano and a few others you started to use it following the aftermath of the Harvey Weinstein sexual misconduct allegations. Weinstein being a former film producer and co-chairman of the Weinstein Company. So the movement focuses on awareness to uncover the pervasiveness of sexual harassment in our society, and has become a platform for primarily women to share personal experience of sexual harassment and abuse. And since it's also evolved to be a platform for holding perpetrators accountable and responsible in order to stop the cycle. So the next question is what is the Time's Up movement? And the Time's Up movement is a movement that actually grew out of the MeToo and grew out of what was referred to as the Weinstein effect. And that was just the sheer amount of people that were coming forward and making serious sexual misconduct allegations against powerful and famous men who had been apparently committing and getting away with this behavior for years and years. So it was really the action that follows from Me Too, and as of February of 2018, it had accumulated a $200 million legal defense fund, together with about 200 volunteer lawyers that were willing to donate time to protect and represent individuals who had been subjected to sexual harassment in the past. Now, the motto on the website of the Time's Up movement is, "The clock has run out on sexual assault, harassment, and inequality in the workplace. It is time to do something about it." So the Time's Up movement and Me Too started in Hollywood, and what we saw, I guess, in the news would be, yes, a lot of Hollywood figures that were being named. There was some activity that I was aware of in various news organizations in the States where there were some higher profile sexual harassment cases. Beyond that, I'm really not familiar with what went on in the United States, what trajectory the Me Too and Time's Up movement has had in the States, only because I have not been tracking it. What I did notice, just like many of us, is we did start to see the movement, evidence that the movement was having an effect in Canada, which is a good thing. And we saw some higher profile sexual harassment allegations that were made in primarily Ottawa, and also in various political organizations, federal and provincial party organizations. And in addition, in a theater that would have been a higher profile sexual misconduct allegation of note. So what we're seeing is we were seeing a higher increased level of awareness and an increased willingness to act and respond and confront, if you will, among women in Canada who were subjected to different levels of sexual harassment, misconduct, abuse, and discrimination. So one of the things, and one of the very instructive responses that I like to, it kind of jumped out at me, was from Michelle Rempel, who indicated that using the Whisper Network, the gossip chain that we used to tell each other when we see something or hear something, can no longer be seen as the main way to manage incidents or harassment. And what Michelle is referring to, and I've heard from other sources, is that female staffers in government, for example, instead of confronting a male counterpart of significant power directly, they would manage laterally among themselves, just to protect themselves from increased exposure, like don't be in an elevator alone with this guy and all that. So there was this gossip thing where women staffers were trying to protect each other from being exposed to the potential for sexual harassment versus confronting the individual. And that's not a victim blaming thing. Michelle's just saying is that was the main way of addressing this, and that cannot no longer be the way to address this, that organizations have to step up and confront the behavior directly. And so that was I would call that an instructive response. Also, Michelle indicated that it is a privileged system that does nothing to protect victims, nothing to empower them to come forward and report abuse, and nothing to prevent violence, and nothing to prevent vexatious complaints from being made. And the word privileged here that Michelle is using is actually ties into a little bit of a nuance that would be unique to within political parties and political organizations that primarily stood behind, where men stood behind parliamentary privilege, and essentially were not subject to the same standards of behavior that other people in normal employment scenarios would be subjected to. So I will say that Parliament it's not exactly an informative place to look in terms of how most companies have been behaving and treating this for years. But in any event, Michelle's put her and a number of other MPs put their foot down and indicated that this parliamentary privilege is not going to be a shield that men in Parliament could rely upon in the future. And I think that, again, is a very instructive and crystal clear response and signal as to where things need to go, should have gone, but in any event need to go in a post-MeToo and Time's Up environment. And then it got weird. We started to see cases in Canada arising that the responses for which became less instructive, in fact, confusing. And again, we're not talking about the allegations themselves so much as the responses. And we're not talking about the movement, the MeToo movement or the Time's Up movement. We're talking about organizational responses to allegations and individuals accessing their rights pursuant to respect in the workplace policies and anti-harassment policies and whatnot. So what happened here, I'm going to use the NDP as an example just because this was fairly clean and dispassionate example, but there have been other missteps, and Patrick Brown does come to mind from the Conservatives, but that one's messy and there's a lot to that one, which I think confuses the issue here that I just want to raise in terms of how organizations are going to respond. So just briefly on this fact set, Aaron Weir is a member of Parliament, an NDP member of Parliament, who had sent an email, and at this point in time there was no live issue that seemed to be apparent to Mr. Weir, but he sent an email to his NDP member of Parliament colleagues indicating that he had an interest in putting his name forward for caucus chair. And in a reply to all email, a political rival, Christine Moore, also of NDP, but a political rival perhaps for the caucus chair, replied to all and indicated that you were the last person in caucus I would like to see have this position, and then went further to allege that, without naming any staffers or incidents or behavior, just to indicate that various women have said that they are uncomfortable being in Mr. Weir's office. And it would seem to me, I'm not even sure why she would even know that, but regardless, Mr. Weir was the same way. He went on to CTV's question period with Evan Solomon the week after and said, look, I don't even know what's being alleged. And he was willing to participate in an investigation, but he doesn't know what the investigation was ultimately going to be about, because he was not aware of an incident that was offending him. And I think there was some public intuition, if you will, a little bit of a questioning among men and women in the public about what's going on here. There doesn't seem to be due process, or seems to be a lack of natural justice in terms of the principle of natural justice, that an individual has an opportunity to face his accuser, which just means to know what is being alleged about him or her. In any event, Jagmeet Singh, the leader of the NDP, went very quickly out in public saying that the first step is always to believe the survivors. We need to believe the survivors. Well, hold on a second. First of all, I've done a number of these investigations, and we don't call them survivors. There's complainants to respect in the workplace policy, and there's respondents to respect in the workplace policy. They're not survivors. They're not Holocaust survivors. They're not survivors. And we're not dealing with criminal cases in terms of per se of rape and all that. Like, I'm not talking about criminal justice. I'm just talking about within an organizational, administrative law, usually an employer type of context. So yeah, an individual that raises a complaint or an issue pursuant to a respect in the workplace policy or a harassment policy, they're called complainants. And they're called complainants for a reason. Because we don't know if their complaint is valid or not until there's been an investigation that's occurred. Now here, without having any facts or any time spent trying to understand the other side of the story, the leader of the NDP jumps in a very public way announcing that he has to believe the survivor, which again, in this case, there isn't even any survivor or complainant identified. There is no known complainant. There's just an allegation from a political rival. So anyways, that brings about a bunch of concerns, and I think it started to get people to ask questions about or query, again, not the TimesUp movement, or the MeToo movement. They started to question how organizations were reacting and responding to this, because there still is a value in the principle of natural justice and due process, and general public, both men and women, want to see a high integrity policy and system in place that is not just about mob justice. And it's not a harassment policy that can be weaponized by individuals for other purposes. But in any event, at an interview later on, Aaron Weir did just mention, and almost reluctantly just noted, that the attack came as a response to his announcing his candidacy for caucus chair. So there was a hint or a sense that this whole thing could have been politically motivated. But the consequence arising out of this, and this still is to this day, is Jagmeet Singh had suspended Mr. Weir's duties until the investigation is complete, and so that I think a lot of people in public perceive that to be harsh as well, in the absence of nothing that seemed to be apparent that needed to be addressed on an urgent basis. At least no facts that would suggest that would need to be the case. So here's where we see a little bit of a break in, I guess, perception of where things were going and how organizations should respond. Very highly visible and put forward by, again, one of the poorer performers in Canada, that being a political party. It doesn't really reflect where Canada's employers are, but in any event, it raises expectations. It confuses things in the general public. It also confuses employees of organizations who have been doing it right, in terms of where are the lines. And I think overall, in the long term, it's going to be healthy, but that doesn't mean that there's going to be some friction. Hopefully mostly constructive friction, as individuals and their employers and organizations figure out where the lines are again. Okay, with all this, and more. But just for now, just to reset, we need to reset a few perceptions, because some of our experience to date has just got a few key concepts, I think, confused. And it's natural to see how we got here, but we just need to reset it so we can carry on having a productive conversation on this. First of all, because of the sensationalization and the high profile nature of a number of the cases that have come up and the publicity around it, the idea of confidentiality has been distorted. And confidentiality is a very important principle in responding to a respect in the workplace allegation, whether it's bullying, sexual harassment, or any of them. Confidentiality is important. It's an employee personnel file. And that is still the case. MeToo movement and the responses to it have never changed that. Confidentiality is still appropriate. And just because something's confidential, that doesn't mean that organizations are not doing something about it. And that, I think, needs to be restored. And my head snapped back actually listening to a CBC Power Panel discussion where Ian Capstick seemed to suggest that a lot of these investigations needed to be fully transparent and open and 360. And I was like, that might be the case. Transparency is, of course, appropriate in the political realm, but not when it comes to a human resource or an organizational response that requires an investigation first to determine what's going on. And investigations need to be conducted in a dignified and confidential manner, and then the conclusions and findings need to be released to the appropriate parties. But the other thing is expectations need to be toned down. Yes, Me Too has brought a lot of high-profile and powerful people who've been getting away with horrible behavior for quite some time down, which is a good thing. But that there's an emotion that can build up, and a certain mob justice that can build and build and build, and the momentum can spin out of control. And I think we just see that expectation that things, there's going to be, the hammer's going to fall regardless when any allegation or investigation is launched, that someone has to pay. And these are human relation issues, and they're complex, and there's usually 15 sides to the two-person story. So it's complex, and to say that it's not complex, if it wasn't complex, there wouldn't be interpersonal conflicts. So we need to appreciate the complexity and understand that there's going to be misperceptions where just simply people feel harmed when they haven't been. There's going to be people who have been harmed and they raise complaints and they are harmed, and it's going to be to such a degree that the offending individual has to leave. It's a capital offense. That happens a lot. There's also going to be cases where people were harmed, but not to the degree that they believe they were harmed, and it's repairable, and it's possible to have the two parties move forward in a safe and dignified way, working together in the same organization. And there's all kinds of iterations and probabilities that might come about, but it's all pinned on the investigation. The other thing that needs to be restored is, yes, neutrality in investigation is an absolute must. It's an absolute must, and it's still a good thing. And what Jagmeet Singh said about, we have to believe the survivors without having any facts, is just the complete wrong message. People conducting respect in the workplace investigations need to be neutral. They need to be independent from the parties involved in the investigation. They need to be neutral, and they need to act neutral throughout in order to maintain the integrity of the investigative process. And we'll get into that in our segment on investigations, specifically on investigations. And the other thing I just want to mention again is Canada's still burning from that Jian Ghomeshi file. And that Jian Ghomeshi file did a lot of damage. Here you have someone who had a fairly high profile interface with a lot of women. And yes, he was found not guilty in the criminal or the court investigations, the court process. But and a lot of folks were really suffered a lot of heartburn about that, and that might be the case. But as it relates to employers, okay, that was not a bad news story. John Gomeshi lost his job. Okay? And again, employers have and continue to have the ability to act and respond to this kind of thing. So as much as what we'll get to here is if employers do have a policy and operate properly and have been and continue to, they're in good shape. Canada is not as bad as Ottawa, and is not as bad as Hollywood. To conclude this segment, I just want to talk about what employers need to do if they haven't already. And yes, employers should have done a lot already. But the day and age of not having a work rule specifically to address harassment, including sexual harassment in the workplace, are over. Even if your staff accidentally come to the right conclusion, you're going to get sued by either the person that you terminate for not having a policy or the person that was asking for your protection because you didn't have a policy. Not only that, with these kinds of questions, how you get to the answer is almost just as important as getting the answer. It's like long division in grade 5. You got just as many points for showing your work as getting the right answer. And just because these investigations and files are confidential in the first instance doesn't mean that they might not be reviewed by some kind of adjudicator, whether it be a court or a human rights tribunal or an arbitrator. Someone has a potential to review what's going on, and they need to see the steps you took to get to the conclusions that you arrived at. And in order to do that, you actually have to have a work rule, a policy, a standard in place. For employers that have a good work rule already, like the Construction Owners Association respecting the workplace policy or some iteration of it, something similar to that kind of standard of work rule, then you're in good shape. What will probably happen is you're probably just going to have a few more files that arrive that get put forward because the expectations of some of your employees may be elevated, and that's a good thing. I mean, the nice thing about having an adequate work rule is that it allows for an evolution, like a history and an evolution and a relationship with your employees and the standards that you set for your employees that evolve over time. So expect that you may have some more investigations that come your way, and you're going to have to just step up the diligence and ensure that you have the investigations right, because that's the next ground, I believe, where a lot of these files and cases are going to be tested on, is how well the investigations are conducted and making sure that investigators are not influenced by either directly or indirectly by business decisions to let things slide, especially when it's a manager that might be performing in a very high capacity in another area. And I guess that's the last point that I want to make right now is, and I've seen it. I've never condoned it, but I've seen it. The days where the person's just too good, he's too valuable to the organization to manage his behavior, are gone. So employers, get that out of your head. These things, you cannot let them slide anymore. And in fact, you shouldn't have in the first place, but you absolutely are going to get burned if you or people in your organization have that attitude. Nobody in your organization is too good to adhere to respect in the workplace policy, whether it's sexual harassment, general harassment, bullying, and certainly not violence. Good day.